Hello everyone, today we talk about Bronze Age chariot warfare as a foreword really to our series on Bronze Age warfare that I started last year, and as you know we have mostly made more manualistic content in the last month. We will resume military history soon in full regime, say. And I think it's important to remember last year when I asked generally what kind of topics you would have liked to see discussed. Some said, why not Bronze Age warfare? And that's something that I was to start anyway at some point. So this can be the first step. I already made some video about Bronze Age warfare, but it was something very, detailed, right? Certain types of chariots and differences over time. It's actually a big thing, right? Because we are talking about factually millennia of history. So albeit, as we will see now, we know very few on how warfare actually was. Still, exactly because of this, we still, however, don't lack, in fact, the evidence. We lack rather the possibility of verifying the accuracy of our theories on that. In fact, one of the few certainties that we can count on the forms of warfare in the Bronze Age is that of the main role in combat was played by chariots, pulled by pairs of horses. Cavalry was something recent. There were in Bronze Age, especially in the latter phase, properly horsemen, right, riding on horseback, but horses mostly pulled chariots, and this fit with broadly for technical reasons, but also the structure of these people's societies, the importance of surplus that were starting to essentially coalesce from the union of different powers, cities, and the possibility of fielding these war machines that essentially in open field were to first soften up and then smash into the ranks of infantry up until at least the cohesion of the latter wouldn't increase, and also horsemanship properly supplanted the chariots for the reasons that we will see now. All balances that are not much due to technology per se, but again to broader political and social factors. And regarding this general consideration of war chariots as essentially the Schwerpunkt of the same Bronze Age warfare, is more or less everything, right? Because for the rest, we are always at ever more labile conjecturing. We see that the power of the kings was counted by the number of chariots they possessed. This suggests, leaving very few uncertainties, the documents and iconography of the period, such as, for example, those relating to the Battle of Kadesh in 1275 BC. We will perhaps talk about it soon. That is estimated to have been the largest battle of chariots in history, something between 5,000 and 6,000 of them. Also would lead to what is considered at least the first known peace treaty in history later on between Egypt and the Hittites, and it's considering the times and places, right? In relative terms, it can be as well as the best documented battle for in antiquity at least, considering again the times and the places. On the platform of the chariot, the Egyptians, that are definitely the most representative powers, and also essentially also in here some of the best documented, if not the best documented, from a military point of view, had for the time had only one fighter, right, armed with a composite bow and javelins, in addition to the coachman, while the Hittites on heavier chariots also had room for a squire. I created even a playlist on chariot warfare, the trend as we will see, historically would be the one to the having of chariots, because in parallel this was required by the having of infantry. And this shows also, so in contemporary times, how a power like the Hittite one was probably relying on heavier infantries as the later ones of the sea peoples. More generally, this idea that peoples coming from the north, from the more militarized realities, were normally having a greater cohesion of the warriors in general, and so that the technical element had to adapt to become, in a sense, rarer, more costly, like the heavier chariot, as it would fundamentally survive up to the 2nd century BC on the battlefields. That, however, in fact, had become, just this massive things that were just thrown at the enemy, hoping to smash it, right? Just even, or simply hoping that the enemy would open its ranks, dissolving them before even impact, because that was the most important aspect psychologically, even before the physical impact, as anything human. Actually, it's the idea, it's the moral force behind the physical action, or the expectation of it, that has a strategic weight per se, right? Even just in the expectation of it. And so there is in general this difference that, by say, full Bronze Age warfare can be irrelevant, given that still there was no alternative to chariots, right, as a decisive arm. But the standard, in fact, of especially of peoples like the Egyptians or Mesopotamia and other areas, was normally a lighter type of chariot, also therefore a larger number of it, and aimed at very intense interaction among each other, also in part with the infantry, of course, and later on with the incipient cavalry. The same, as you know, chariot warfare had basically emerged in the Western steppes. We made a video about that too, the invention of cavalry, literally, and had spread all over Eurasia, fundamentally, in different degrees, right? The same. Think about the Sumers that had this kind of more like transportation means originally, and that this gradually evolved into something more, in fact, more sophisticated in the more advanced civilization later on. So this could be traced in detail, and that's why I will make probably hundreds, if not thousands, of videos on the topic, but that will be for another time. Now, of course, there are differences properly in the political and social organization. As we were saying before, Egypt could rely on a much larger amount of resources, centralized system, infrastructures, etc., whereas more warlike, militaristic cultures like the Hittites were somewhat more lordly in nature, and therefore had some kind of proto-feudal mentality, with the idea of the squire, of also a more important retinue of infantry, probably, by some degree, etc. And this will all coalesce towards certain directions we were hinting at before. So the dominance of chariots on the battlefield began around 2000 BC, with the invention of the spoked wheel that made the chariot much lighter, therefore allowing it to be pulled by horses, and also transforming these into a weapon of war, and therefore making the chariot itself even more agile and fast. Right before wheels were full, the previous system made the chariot way more stable, but also more cumbersome. Right, and so the spoked wheel instead allowed a dramatic agility that could fit the tactical, in fact, needs that we will see now were enacted. Further technological advances made the chariot an increasingly light, but also robust, and at the same time stable vehicle. And this is in fact particularly important because, again, the war chariot had not been developed in areas, say, like the Egyptian one that we'll describe today most. But when it was introduced, it could effectively be produced in large amounts and therefore increasing the, let's say, properly the tactical development and coordination within the same large amount of chariots. Thus, the necessity of making it lighter, right? And given that these were the powers that were ruling the world at the time, still it became standardized practically in the hottest, let's say, areas, militarily speaking, and where a greater war was waged, and so the surroundings were, if you want, relatively less updated. But this is also a relative idea, because at the same time we see a striking homogeneity in certain areas and that are also quite distant, and that is mostly a optical distortion because of the lack of documentation in some of the more primitive areas that simply couldn't leave us but artifacts, but some of which are in fact quite eloquent regarding the incredible technological quality, but at the same time where warfare altogether was less sophisticated, and this is normal in many areas. So there is the archaism and the modernity already at this point struggling, depending on how warfare was declined in the various areas. The Egyptian chariot was equipped with a braided leather platform that cushioned the jolts due to the unevenness of the ground, helping the stabilization of the bow or javelin shot, right, as a suspension, right, so to maintain the chariot as stable as possible while running on even uneven terrain that naturally was avoided most of the times. Needless to say that the chariot couldn't be employed, but on certain particular ground, effectively, especially the larger the amount of the chariots, right? And so the larger the amount of the enemy. This is in part true or in general for any other formation, but especially for the chariot itself, that required enough space and properly also a certain concentration of force of other chariots to be effective. It could be devastating, as we will see now. The axle on which the thin 6-spoke wheels were mounted instead was fixed to the rear of the wagon and was longer than the platform by about 25 centimeters on each side, giving even greater stability and agility to the vehicle. That, as you understand, as being used primarily as a missile platform, was crucially depending also in the further smashing, charging, shock charge effectiveness on the degree by which the shots had softened up the enemy formation. That's why also mass was particularly important, because especially as always it is as a principle of warfare, but the chariot eventually had to smash in through the enemy lines and not remaining trapped, because once the chariot stopped into infantry, it was extremely vulnerable, right? And this was true even in the fight among the various chariots, because as we will see, chariots were followed by infantry, by some infantry at least, in the process. So they had to keep running, they had to keep moving, right, and possibly in an orderly way, and we will see how. And to turn the chariot into a weapon of war, naturally you had to equip it with a crew. That is highly selected individuals, because fighting on a chariot requires exceptional reflexes and an equally special sense of balance. which means a lot of training. And so these people also are an asset themselves. Besides the same chariot costs, especially the one of maintenance, were enormous, leaving aside the one of the horses, etc. So a long training transformed the crew into a close-knit team, a real arm system, like on a tank, as we would say today. This was true in other, even the same cavalry later on, right? Was with squires literally shouting to the heavily armored masters where the enemy was, because their sight and hearing was reduced, etc. Was not very different from, say, what a tank commander and gunner and drivers actually interact, right? And the chariot was fundamentally also like this, because everyone was essentially performing a very specific task on which the whole team relied on vitally in combat. The setting of the fight was the responsibility of the coachman, because he was the one who drove the chariot, and therefore, decided where it would have to expose itself, to strike, to engage in combat with other chariots, while the archer, who was shooting from only one side of the chariot, had the task of hitting the opponent with the arrows of his composite bow. And despite its range in combat of about 180 meters, it is likely that the battles soon turned into an intense whirlwind series of much closer duels. Ideally, as we will see now, it was a caracole tactic, for which also chariot rows were essentially wheeling always one side. And this is the reason why this was a preference, also based on the simple right and left orientation of human beings, that was exploited to functionalize the arrow shot. But literally in melee, and especially among the chariots that could also smash into each other, you can imagine the confusion, the risk, the different types of targets, because mainly the primary target was the enemy horses that were well armored for this reason. So you needed really sharp shooters for doing that. But also there could be, a guy running at you with an axe on foot. You needed to take him down before he would still kill himself, but may cause unequal damage to you. So, speaking of the organization, the chariots were gathered in decimal units, and it is probable that they did not fight in lines, but in columns of 5 to 10 vehicles. There were probably some switching capacity in that regard as well, but it's very important, because eventually this rows or lines have to turn into, depending on the choice, turn into autonomous units that have to rely on each other. So you have to have pre-organized them so that they know how to interact with the crew with crew, and relying on each other in combat. The horse, furthermore, is an intelligent animal that spontaneously avoids obstacles. So the formation in column allows to exploit the agility of the mean and gives depth to the attack. It's easier just to follow the trail. This was used also with other animals later on, the elephants, for example, that charged in a row with a female in heat at the head. Literally, that's how it happened. All the males following. Naturally, the horse functioning much more, flexibly on the battlefield, being also much more, in fact, versatile and aggressive and beast in combat that bites, kicks, etc. Both the crew and the horses were protected by armor in metal or leather plates, and to endure them, a very precise shot was required, or at a short distance, and therefore with greater penetration force. That's why also javelins were important at a close range. And you can understand at this point how intense the chariot clashes was, and how crucial also properly there the maintenance of the formation, the properly the robustness of both the chariots and the horses there was, because again, it's mostly a matter of mass, right? If immediately you can test that the enemy for some structural reason, because really these pitched battles were rare, and literally the fate of the various powers depended on them, because the assets were so great in relative terms that just one battle could wipe out an entire domination, simply because those who were under it would at that point become immediately more powerful in relative terms. It could autonomize themselves. So it could and would happen often if just Bronze Age history, politically, even eventually speaking. And so if it was a great concert of qualities, right, deriving from, of course, command, morale, training, equipment, that would make these systems needing to rely on intense cooperation, right? And as we will see now, the point that was the victorious side would have hopefully enough force at that point to break through the remaining forces, mostly the infantry, and simply scatter them, wipe them out, chasing them, cutting them down. So at some point we will make an illustration of the particular case of a tank formation attack in the infantry today, right? And this is very similar to what doctrinally Bronze Age chariot warfare worked like in comparison. The column formation helping that, because fundamentally it exposed less front to the infantry line that instead was deployed in line and not relying instead on columns, and that therefore could literally pierce through thanks to the sheer impact, the shock force of the charge, and letting all the other chariots following the first one, and therefore penetrating deep to the infantry formation, not giving them a chance of properly managing to interrupt this this attack, and therefore separating them dangerously so they could be eventually shot down better as isolated groups and overwhelmed instead by the bulk of your infantry that at that point would have followed the chariots and mopped up the disorderly infantry formation. However, this tactics, let's say, was a bit the exception, not the rule. It was the manualistic expectation. We could call it like this, because the infantry were reserved, say, a series of secondary roles that, as we've seen, were present pretty much everywhere. The most important of which, in fact, was to accompany the same fight between the chariots by running, right? In the Iron Age, chariots would practically disappear and be replaced by real cavalry, right? That would be, at that point, much more practical and economical. And the queen of battlefields would become the infantry, however, as a consequence, that given that it was the infantry at that point the major the major reason for which chariot warfare declined, and this primacy will be lost only for a short time during the Middle Ages. So it's obvious that the infantry would functionalize gradually in an anti-chariot capacity, right, by increasing the cohesion, improving the equipment. The world again was emerging, right, in the technical phase that we know today. But of course, it was primarily a matter of moral force, right? That the greatest moral force, and not just a material one, was loaded on the chariots, because the people who could afford that kind of training and equipment were the ones that ruled. They had the greater motivation, the greater skills and will, and we're talking about Bronze Age, so we're when you see someone covered in metal, like the dreadfully looking dendra panoply that obscures your sight and basically reduce your senses. You know, if you know how to just stay on it under the Mediterranean sun. However, you may never know whether you are in presence of a human or of a god, right? Most of the times you would think it's a demigod that would just land on your in your country and subjugate you from the celestial superiority, and that you will have to work for eventually, while he, in fact, rides chariots and lives in fortified residences, and you just work the land for him, right? So we're talking about times where these assets were really divine in nature and conceived as such. And regarding these heroes, we come to the sore point, because an army based on chariots was indeed the best that the technology of the time could offer. This is true, but the cost of its maintenance was very high, sustainable only by the richest states, so huge that the royal stables must have been providing for and looking after the animals at the expense of the royal treasury. So a very technocratic system that could exist just in the presence of an important political stability and continuity that very often could not properly be achieved, not even through these means that in fact could be floating on the broader political, military and social issues. So if raising and feeding the horses was an undertaking, the chariot itself, often owned by the warrior, was even more expensive, not only considering the construction costs, but above all of its maintenance. And you couldn't really even fight everywhere with them, right? So you needed anyhow to keep developing some other types of forces. And in fact, we find pretty much everywhere emerging, right, were some peoples that eventually would come to disrupt the order that brought in this greater punching infantry capacity and cavalry, as a matter of fact. But everybody more or less goes towards that direction, so that studying Bronze Age warfare as always is studying, as every period in history, a transitional phase, because that's always how it goes. And there is an even greater problem, which could not be solved only in fact with economical resources, represented by the long line of specialized craftsmen needed to build the wagons and to keep them efficient, and by the small army of administrators who had to keep the accounts of all this apparatus. And was there, worth it, right? Couldn't that resource be invested in the development of other arms, right? Gradually, if the balance would shift in favor of this latter option, not because the initial one had been, inefficient, right? It's just that the conditions for it to keep going on were essentially disappearing. Initially, only the most organized and efficient states could afford such military systems centered on warehouses of spare parts, even before warriors, right, fixing the chariots and having enough supplies to train, right, probably to engineer the creation of a war chariot crew that could be fielded, in fact, in large numbers. And this is the same reason, in fact, why chariot warfare continued to exist instead among those areas like Northern Europe or North African hinterland at least, that still had communities that were based, in a sense, on the possibility, not much to keep this larger numbers, but still the aforementioned lordly charioteer system, right? Whereas with a feudal reality fundamentally, whereas the more advanced civilization would pass to something said way more effective, based properly on the cooperation of various arms that surely didn't saw the disappearance of chariot warfare immediately, but subordinated it to the other arms and essentially changed properly their, at least in relative terms, the function of the chariot on the battlefield, passing from mostly this skirmishing and fighting platform that would eventually just hopefully find no other resistance after having defeated the other chariot force, to essentially like a massive wagon that had to be launched literally straight into the heavy, thickly packed infantry formations in order properly to disrupt, just to open gaps in them. And if you want, in fact, it's a regression in chariot tactics, in the employment of it. In a sense, it's just brute force, right? But that's what effectively had turned into, given that the infantry and the cavalry per se had that missile and especially fighting, hand-to-hand fighting capacity on a much greater and more effective scale. And so when the infantry of the sea peoples proved capable of effectively resisting the chariot charges, the dominance of the chariots on the battlefield ended dramatically, because it also dragged in the process the civilization for which they had fought with them into decline, right? And the main reason, as always, is not much just the technical side of the story, whether properly, because cavalry technology at that point had become more effective. There weren't massive technological changes at this point, not even for the infantry in practice, right? They could have been big in relative terms for the time, but the even bigger dynamic was obviously moral, right? There were peoples that were becoming kind of tougher and tougher in terms of military organization, of political cohesion, and therefore could field simply men who had the strength, primarily a moral one, right, and then a tactical one, wherever it was achieved, to withstand chariot missile fire and shock charge, and therefore to put in crisis the whole system. And it's simple as that, right? It wasn't the sea peoples weren't more technologically advanced, weren't more, they weren't a superior civilization. They were just tougher morally, and they also were essentially to take over the system, to still maintain their own chariot warfare that factually goes on for a long time, right? Even if by the 2nd century BC you have the last, the Seleucid Empire, last traces of chariot warfare behind, the chariot always remained the symbol of the hero. In the Roman triumph, even in, medieval Chorasmia, the greatest symbol was the golden chariot of the skies, or the celestial, in fact, mythology of the Indo-Europeans that took over eventually from the north, and that had always challenged, in fact, this greater civilizations, and from which the same, in fact, chariot technology had stemmed from, right? We find even in the Balkans, in Roman imperial times, so the local aristocracy, or Romanized aristocracy, framed within the broader civil, that still buried its own members together with chariots. Right? At that time, it's also a bit of a mix, because those who waged war on chariots habitually were incinerated after death, because that was returning to the sky, and the chariot as a mean as achieving that. But these are just cultural intersections with the Pelasgian cultures, the more sedentary, chthonic, telluric ones. But still, this is to say how important this platform really is, because the ideal in the Bronze Age is that the warrior doesn't factually even need intentionally to go on the battlefield. He's just brought on the battlefield by obedience of the world forces, and the only thing he has to do is pure action, is pure combat, descending from the chariot, fighting against another hero, restoring the world order, and just being dragged by the same forces. At that point, either somewhere else on Earth, or even transfiguring and ascending to the skies to sit next to the gods as a peer of them. And this goes naturally along with many other considerations about properly the nature of these military cultures that should always be borne in mind before any other possible material consideration about the technology, about whatever. And so really, this is just an appetizer. We will keep talking about properly chariot warfare, tactics, organization, and much else. Just in fact, were chariot related. We're not talking about the other arms. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.